Hello and welcome. I'm Suchetna Ray and we come to you live from the Hindustan Times office in New Delhi. I have with me my colleague, my very senior colleague actually, the Chief Content Officer Rajesh Mahapatra. We're going to talk about the government GDP numbers of 7% that the government released very recently. Ever since this number came out, 7%, and you have to remember that this talks about the period when demonetization had hit India, and there have been murmurs and talks about whether this number is suspect. Rajesh, your first thoughts about the 7% GDP number. Do you think it's too good to be true?
They look too good to be true. And I think there is justifiably a lot of controversy around it. A lot of eyebrows have been raised. So just to recap for our readers and our audience now. So what is it that people are talking about? A month ago, the government came up with its first forecast for the financial year 2016-17 and said that it expects GDP to grow 7.1%, down from 7.6% last year. And it said that this 7.1% growth forecast doesn't take into account the impact of demonetization, because at that point in time they said they had yet to assess the impact of demonetization. And as it happens with the government statistical department, a month later, which is toward the end of February, they come up with a second revised forecast for the current financial year. And they said that forecast, which was released earlier this week, it showed that they are still sticking to the fact, to the expectation that the economy would grow 7.1%. Now that has raised eyebrows amongst economists and analysts who believe that, and that 7.1% was based on the estimate that in the October-December quarter, GDP grew 7%.
Right.
Now, so people are asking, if it really increased 7%, where is the party?
And that's a demonetization quarter.
Yes, and it is difficult to believe because 7% growth in October-December. We had, in the preceding quarter, GDP had grown at about 7.4, and the revised estimates now show 7.4, and the first quarter of the financial year was 7.2. So they were averaging around 7.3, 7.1%. And people had expected that post demonetization, when people didn't have money to spend,
Consumption must have gone down.
Consumption would have taken a big hit. Informal sector would have taken a big hit. The entire construction sector came to a grinding halt, which accounts for more than 10% of the economy. A lot of commercial transactions slowed down. The banks were busy managing the ATMs, managing long queues outside the banks. There was a lot of chaos.
So loan disbursement took a hit?
Of course, not only that, they wouldn't have had time to get down to giving loans, but because there was so much of uncertainty that companies wouldn't have been even thinking of taking fresh loans to invest, and even consumers would have been wary. We also saw car sales, auto sales taking a big hit, especially in the two-wheeler segment. Right. We had, this also coincided with the wedding season, when you usually see an uptick because there's a lot of spending. That also came to a grinding halt. So people are wondering that if all the stories,
this number come from?
If all the stories they heard about consumption taking a big hit, people losing their jobs, then how is it possible? And was much of uncertainty which would have held companies back from making new investments. So how is it that the government is saying private consumption spending increased 10%, which was it's twice the pace in the previous quarter when it had grown at 5%. How is it that investment, which had actually been decelerating and for 3 straight quarters had gone down, it suddenly shows an upturn. So that's becoming a little difficult for people to understand and accept. And therefore people are end up making the conclusion that perhaps the government, in its enthusiasm to prove
High growth trajectory.
that demonetization was not all that bad is probably cooking up data. Now,
That brings me to my second question, actually. And for all of you who are watching us, if you're liking what you're seeing, please press the like button, share it with your friends, and do send in your questions. We are talking about India's GDP number, which the government released a few days back. We're discussing whether it is too good to be true. My second question, Rajesh, is that there have been again several allegations. India with this number is going into the China category. China has been blamed for decades together for cooking their books, for inflating their numbers. Do you think such an allegation is fair?
Well, it's prompting some people to draw those parallels.
Right.
And now, China and India, in one respect, India is surely and has been miles ahead of China.
Yeah.
When it comes to data reporting, India has always had, among developing countries, one of the most robust systems. You know, I think the year was 1998, when we signed up for the international data dissemination system of the International Monetary Fund. We were one of the first developers. We may curse the Brits for everything, but one thing we must thank them for, because the whole data reporting structure, data collection structure is an inheritance from the colonial time, and we did invest in the later years a lot in making this a robust data reporting structure. My concern is that if people are now starting to draw parallels with China, is the credibility of our statistical system coming under scrutiny, and that
Lots of people who are sharing your view, Rajesh. There's Sunil who's written to us that he doesn't believe the number. How can it be 7%? That's exactly what we're discussing, Sunil. How can it be a 7%?
So I won't say that somebody has deliberately cooked the data, but I would go to the extent of saying that there are a few checks that our statisticians should have had while estimating the numbers, and I am tempted to say that they perhaps haven't done that.
Azhar is saying, for example, and what you've also been mentioning, that if we have a 7% growth, why is it not showing on the ground? There's still unemployment, there's industrial sickness. How can we explain that, is what Azhar is asking.
Because in reality, there may not have been a 7% growth, but it is possible that in statistics, you could still show a 7% growth even without technically cooking the data.
So you mean to say the method is not correct?
There are certain flaws. Let me sort of take you to what the chief statistician in the government of India, who is TCA Anand, he is a very well-known economist and now heads the Central Statistical Organization, which comes up with this data and which is the owner of this data. Now, you know, he gave an interview to Business Standard and he gives the explanation for why the numbers are the way they are, and in a way, it amounts to a justification for the number that they have come up with, and in another way, it also points to the loopholes that exist in the way we compile the data. Yes. So let's say what is happening. So the government estimates GDP by looking at how people are spending. So you look at the expenditure data. You say, you know, how much private spending has taken place,
right,
how much government spending has taken place, how much spending has gone into creating assets, which is investment, which technically is called the gross fixed capital formation. You look at what differential exists between exports and imports. So that also gives you the consumption that hasn't happened on your territory, but it has happened somewhere else, but for which you have produced things. Yeah. Okay, and so they add up all that figure to get the GDP estimate. Okay. Now, so how do you estimate the consumption data? Let us first take that. Now, consumption data has got two components: private spending, government spending. Now, government spending, we know that data is there. So there would have been a little spike in government spending because some of the 7th Pay Commission payout happened, probably spilled over to October, the month of October. In private spending, there would have been also a spike because October was a festive season. But mind you, Diwali comes during this period every year. So last year also there would have been a spike. So it is not that this spike is on a lower base. So I won't therefore think that a festive season kind of spending would justify it. But how does the government estimate the consumption data? The government actually doesn't get consumption data. It arrives at the consumption data by looking at the production data. So what are the production data it takes? It looks at various kinds of things. Right. It looks at sales tax collection figures and well, if sales tax collection figures are rising in a certain way, the consumption must be tracking that trend. It looks at index of industrial production data and says, well, we'll come to that a little later when we talk about value added. The other thing they look at is they look at what companies report in terms of the stocks that they are holding, right, or the stocks that they are dispersing. Now, what may have happened is that manufacturer is pushing out his manufactured products to the dealers, to the distributors, and that might be getting recorded production data. Right. And let us remember, we were seeing a good upswing in economic activities through the month of September and October. So it is quite possible that manufacturers would have been encouraged to take on more orders to deliver, and that might be getting into the statistics.
But there was no offtake of it.
But that doesn't mean that it is actually getting sold in the so when you take production data to extrapolate consumption data, right, in such a scenario, that runs into a problem. The other thing is about looking at tax collection figures, especially indirect tax collection figures. Now, there is a big issue there. There are several things that probably could have happened there. We know that most of the spike in indirect tax collections have come largely on account of oil revenues. Right. And because the government kept revising both the prices because international prices were going up, and also they kept increasing the excise duties on it. So now there may be some problem over there. Right. Now, what one expects, and similarly, let's also look at the production side of data. Now, we are talking about index of industrial. Why I say that this data to suspect this data is because look at the other things, other data points that we have. We have index of industrial production, which measures IIP, which measures your factory output. Yeah. It contracted in 2 out of 3 months in this quarter. Okay, yes. It contracted by 0.4% in December. It rose marginally in November, and it had contracted in October. So, in 2 out of 3 months, IIP contracted, and if you sort of average it out, it probably was marginally up for the entire quarter. Okay, now how could that translate into an 8.3% growth in manufacturing? That becomes very difficult. You have the second data point we look at. If we look at how much credit offtake was happening from bank, because bank finance is again taken as another representative of consumption data. Yeah. Now, credit offtake has actually been falling.
And you were just mentioning that there's been very little appetite for credit also.
Yes, and we do not know how that data is coming. The last and most intriguing factor is that the investment numbers. Now, investment as a ratio of GDP had been falling for 3 straight quarters, and suddenly we see a big offtake in the October-December quarter. Now, I am not able to figure out how that number has come, because that number...
Hold your thought there, Rajesh. Yeah? There are several questions coming in, several statements coming in. Xavier Thomas is saying, why did the CSO revise the Q3 numbers last year? Is it to give a statistical edge to this year's figures? Very good question. And before we answer that, let's take another one. Samarjit Singh, Rajesh, is saying that the government is claiming that it is on a very high growth trajectory, but people have lost their purchasing power due to demonetization. So how do you relate both? And for all of you who are watching us, if you like it, please press the like button. There are lots of links that there is on our page. Do check them out. Do share this page if you're liking it and write to us with your questions. We are discussing the government's GDP data that they released a few days back, and there are questions whether a 7% growth number is actually too good to be true. Rajesh, back to you. These are the two questions: whether the Q3 numbers, why was it revised?
Let me first take the let's take the question from Thomas. I think it's a very relevant question.
Right.
What the government has done, it has and it does at around this time, it revises the quarterly numbers for the previous year.
Right.
And for 2015-16, we see that earlier report was that the quarter 3 growth for GDP was 7.2%. The government has revised it downward to 6.9%, and we don't know why it has done so. Okay. What we also see that the preceding quarter numbers for GDP were also significantly revised upward. So for Q1 of 2015-16, it went up from 7.5 to 7.8. For Q2, it went up from 7.6 to 8.4, and for third quarter, it has come down from 7.2 to 6.9, and for the fourth quarter, it goes up from 7.9 to 8.6%.
Right.
Okay. Now this is something difficult to digest.
This is suspect.
Because you are trying. It looks like there has been a deliberate attempt to somehow moderate the base.
These
Yes, because
shine more.
why would you see when we know that the upswing that we saw probably sometime in the second quarter of 2015-16 had actually gained momentum through the following quarter. So how could you have a quarter in between, and which happens to be the festive season quarter, and which was actually not bad last year. It was not great, but it wasn't that bad. So by the same logic, why would it go down? So there is no explanation, and I think there is reason to investigate that.
Azhar has an interesting question that what happens to a country when it sees that the GDP figures, in figures they are very high, but there is no economic implication of it on the ground. Interesting question that Azhar is asking, and even Pushpa has a very interesting question. We'll go to Pushpa a little later after we've answered Azhar's
I'm happy
question.
people are asking these questions, because when you tell people that we are growing fast, we are growing at a rapid rate, the expectations are therefore high growth brings in new jobs, high growth brings in new investment, and if people are not seeing these things, they would then question the numbers. That's the first step, and then probably
Question the quality of the numbers also.
And also the quality of growth that is happening. Sometimes we may have growth, and that is precisely what has been happening in our context for the last 5-6 years, where we have been having nearly jobless growth, and that's a matter of concern. And we need to address that. If we go down this way, probably that's not. So let me take up another question that has come up. That's from Anirvan Saha. Is the calculation inflation adjusted? Yes, the numbers that we are talking about are constant numbers. So yes, they are adjusted to inflation. But there also lies another question as to, when statisticians adjust numbers to inflation, they assume certain deflator. Okay, so it would be important to know what deflator has been assumed. So it is quite possible that if you underestimate the deflator, you could end up with a higher real GDP growth. There could be, so so that's what I said. Prima facie, I would not go to the extent of saying that somebody is deliberately cooking the numbers, but I would say, as the chief statistical officer, or the statisticians who are engaged on behalf of the government to compile these numbers, I think they owe it that in a quarter like this, they needed to be more careful about the assumptions that they make while extrapolating these numbers. And I think the bit of due diligence that should have happened probably hasn't happened. In fact, the chief statistician TCA Anant in the same interview says that events, I quote him, events such as demonetization, which are a large policy change, are not assessed by single quarter data. These have many effects and will take time to work their way through the economy. A simple post hoc one quarter number cannot assess these impacts. But yes, the third quarter was a period when demonetization was announced. More than that, I am not going to draw any further conclusions. Now, he is probably right in saying this, but he also owes an explanation to say that did his organization do everything to ensure that there weren't any wrong assumptions that got into working out the numbers. At this point in time, it is very difficult to accept that the CSO did so, and my sense is that at a later date, when they will have to look back at these numbers with greater will, it will have to be revised, and my sense is it will be revised downwards.
We'll take another question that Pushpa Sharma has written to us. She's saying that, and it is absolutely correct, there was a huge spurt in online transaction. Does that impact GDP numbers? And before you take the question, for all of you who are joining us now, if you like what you're seeing, press the like button, share it with your friends and your family, and do write to us. We are talking about the GDP numbers that the government released just a few days back. It's a high growth number of 7% at a time when demonetization was hitting Indians. So is this number too good to be true is what we are discussing. Rajesh Mahapatra, he is the Chief Content Officer of Hindustan Times. He's explaining these numbers, breaking it down for you. So do write to us with all your questions. Rajesh, your answer to Pushpa's question.
Which is
that whether we saw a spurt in online transactions.
Oh yeah. No. They don't. The way the CSO estimates numbers, online transactions will not get factored into it as a different entry. They will be reflected in the consumption in the assumptions they are making to extrapolate data on consumption. So there is you could say that that might be finding manifestation somewhere, but as of now the CSO doesn't do a separate kind of entry for electronic transactions.
Amit Jain is sharing his views with us. He's saying that this government will destroy the credibility of India, and perhaps this will also affect FDI confidence. We've been talking about India's credibility as far as data dissemination in this country is concerned. Rajesh has been at length explaining that, but do you think it will affect FDI confidence somewhere?
It's a matter of concern. What I have said that, during demonetization, I've said that if, what we must be proud of is that we are one of the few developing countries which have built world-class institutions in every field. Right. I have written about it in the past that, the Central Bank of India, the Reserve Bank of India is one such situation, is one such institution. And if anybody has taken a hit in demonetization big time, it was the RBI, its credibility and its reputation. My concern is that when you do not answer the doubts that are being raised by people, these are fairly non-partisan views, and when you do not answer these questions, you raise more suspicion, and that hampers the Central Statistical Organization. Is another fantastic institution we have built. If we do not provide answers to the questions that people are raising about the GDP numbers, we end up undermining the credibility of this institution as well.
Absolutely. We've Pyari Mohan Malik, who's asking us what is the point of a 7.1% GDP if there is no employment generation on the ground. Rajesh has been talking about that at length, and if you've just joined us, he's been talking about jobless growth that India has been seeing for some time now, and he's asking, what can we say we have a viable economy if the country goes through jobless growth for a period of time, Rajesh?
No, it isn't, because in order to grow, you need to invest. In order to invest, you need to be sure that there are people to buy. For people to buy, they need to have money. For them to have money, they need to have jobs. If you do not create jobs, you do not create purchasing power. If you do not create purchasing power, you do not accelerate consumption. If you do not accelerate consumption, there is no incentive to invest. So we are at this point in time broken that virtuous cycle.
Absolutely. Hassan Mehndi Rizvi is saying that what will be your opinion if you then realize that the number then goes down in Q4, the Q3 number of 7.1 goes down in Q4?
Well, we stand vindicated. So it will have to be, because it is difficult to understand. It is difficult to understand that how you could show a 7% growth in a quarter where everybody has seen that economic activities across channels, across various walks of life came to a grinding halt. That is something everybody would vouch for. And even after that you have grown, then the only explanation lies in the way probably people manage to convert their dodgy cash into white money, and in which case I think there are then bigger question marks about the efficacy of demonetization.
Yeah, then Siddharth Shah exactly has the same strain of thought. He's saying that was there a spurt in invoicing to create white money?
I do not, I have nothing, no evidence to say that, but what one hears that there was a spurt in advance tax collections, and it is possible that several companies may have, in their bid to try convert the cash holdings that they had, may have over declared their sales and over declared their incomes during this quarter and filed taxes. If that is the case, we will have to watch in the coming quarters to see what kind of tax refunds take place.
Right. Mr. Rizvi has come back to us. He's asking us whether you think that the data is forged. Mr. Rizvi, thank you for your questions. Rajesh has been trying to address exactly this issue, whether there's been any sort of suspicious activity as far as data collection or data dissemination is concerned.
At this point in time, I would refrain from using the words whether it is forced, but I can say that the way it has been estimated, it lacks credibility.
Thank you so much for your thoughts, Rajesh. For all of you who are watching us, who tuned in to see what we are talking about, if you like what you're seeing, please press the like button, share it with your friends and family. Keep writing to us, keep watching our Facebook page for all the action we are bringing to you from Hindustan Times, from our headquarters here in New Delhi. Do follow us on @HT Tweets. Visit our website to see the latest news and updates.